Hello everyone, my name is Christian. Welcome back to Tekpon. Today our guest is Prasanna, the CEO and co-founder of Uppekha. Hello.
Hi Christian, how are you?
Doing great. Very excited to meet you. Please tell us, what does your company do?
Sure. So we are an accelerator for B2B SaaS startups. So we help folks who are trying to build global B2B SaaS companies grow faster.
Okay, is it only for SaaS?
Yes, we are focused only on B2B SaaS, which is basically folks selling to businesses.
Yeah. And do they have to have some revenue?
Yes, so we take people who have early revenue, so that could be as little as 1 to 5 customers if it's mid-market or enterprise, or it could be, few $1,000s of MRR if it's SMB.
So they have a little bit of, they have to have a little bit of MVP, right? Not just the idea. It makes sense. And is it only in India?
So we have startups that are where the founders are all over the world. We have some founders in the US, some founders in the Middle East, some founders in India. The companies typically are headquartered in the US with subsidiaries in different countries. A large portion of the back-end teams and the front-end teams of the startups that are supporting these businesses, they're in India.
Yeah, that's great. And how do you view SaaS in India in the upcoming years? I see that you predict a boom, right?
Yeah. So if I just give you a little bit of history and context, in 1992, there were only 200 IT services companies in India, which were doing about $100 million of exports. In 2002, there were 8,000 IT services companies doing $12 billion of IT services exports.
And now?
Right? So we think that now it's $150 billion of IT services exports from India, right?
Nice.
So we think that that's the kind of a trajectory that India SaaS is going to have, where we're closer to 1992 with a few hundred startups, maybe $1 billion or few billion in IT service in SaaS product exports. But as the SaaS market globally matures and as India SaaS grows, we'll probably have India SaaS touching tens of billions of dollars, $25 billion in the next 10 years of SaaS exports, with probably going from 400, 500 startups to 5,000, 10,000 SaaS startups in India.
Wow. And how long does it take to do the program?
So the program is 6 months. That's the core part of the program. Then we have an add-on part of the program, which is another 6 months, where we continue working with startups. And then they have lifelong access to the community.
Okay. The last 6 months are optional?
It's basically it changes from a push model to a pull model. So the first 6 months is very structured. There's a lot of content and coaching which is calendared, scheduled. Yeah. And the next 6 months is more events. We have ways of meeting founders. Founders reach out to us, so it's more of a pull model.
Okay, and is it only one a year?
We are doing 3 batches this year. We'll probably do 2 to 3 batches every year.
Wow. And usually how many startups are in a batch?
Between 15 to 20.
That's
1-5.
And why should the startups join Uppekha?
Sure. So from a track record perspective, out of the first 10 startups that we took in the first 2 cohorts, we actually have 7 startups that have crossed $1 million in ARR. We have out of that 7, we have 3 startups that have crossed $5 million in ARR. We have I think 2 startups that exited, and 1 startup that's still figuring out where they are.
Not bad, right?
Not bad. And the interesting thing is that in most of these startups, they've raised very little capital. So founders own 70-80% of equity in these companies. And typically it's employees the rest. And in many of these startups, we are the only outside shareholders.
Wow.
So what we're telling founders is, so for example, one of the founders that spoke to us in the second cohort, his first $1 million ARR took him 9 years. His second $1 million after working with us took him 9 months. And his third $1 million is now taking 7 months. And he has not raised any capital beyond friends and family kind of a round that he did very, very early on.
That's
so that's the kind of outcome that founders in our accelerator have. There's another startup in a more recent cohort. I think last year or maybe 2 years ago, cohort. They were struggling to build revenue for a long time. And since last November 2021, till now, they've gone from nearly zero to almost 800,000 in revenue.
Wow.
And again, no funding. So
These numbers seem unreal.
yeah.
Yeah, wow. And what is the fee for the program?
So we take equity, so 4% equity for the program. We also have $100,000 that we can invest. So if they want to take that $100,000, that will be in a convertible note kind of a format.
What are the main lessons that you teach to founders in those 6 months or 12 months?
Sure. So what we believe and what we want founders to believe is that building startups is not an art.
Okay.
It's a craft, right? There's an engineering. You can actually do it in a series of steps. And so founders, especially in B2B SaaS, if founders think, hey, my business is special, my business is different from everything else, that does not work.
Yeah.
Right? Because in B2B, your buyer is a sophisticated buyer. They understand what they want to buy, and therefore their buying behavior process is pretty predictable. And so if you are doing stuff that matches with their buying behavior, then you're going to be able to sell successfully. If you don't, then it's not going to work out, right? So since we're working primarily with B2B SaaS startups, what we tell them is you have to have a flywheel for your business. And in B2B SaaS, what does that mean? That means that you should be able to attract customers, you should be able to engage them, you should be able to sell them at a low cost, then they should be able to pay you more over time. And those same customers should get you referrals so that your cost of acquisition reduces over time, right? So if all of these pieces are in place, then you can actually build a very capital efficient business. And if you build a capital efficient business, then as this flywheel gets going, just like in the example I shared earlier, founders find out that they can get revenue growth faster and faster as they grow bigger and bigger. Unfortunately, what a lot of founders do is they miss one of these pieces, and then when they start building that, they realize that one of these pieces is very inefficient, and after you build it to a certain scale, it's very hard to change that piece. So by design, if you have all these things in place and then you turn the switch on, then growth is much better.
So you have some basic rules or basic principles that you teach to everybody, and they can apply those. And
right. So for each of these pieces, we have templates, right, which the founders actually can go through and fill out for themselves. We have the previous cohort founders who have done those templates. Their homework essentially is available to see.
Okay.
And we have so there are these are live examples, right? So previous cohort founder has applied it, they've done this is what it looks like, and so that is also available. And then there are previous cohort founders who explain, hey, when I did this module, this is where I was, this is what I changed to, and this is how it has benefited me. So all of this stuff is there in a module. So that way when founders come in and do it, they're not doing it in isolation.
Yes.
But they can actually reach out to that same founder and say, hey, you did this, you had done this, I didn't understand it, could you help me? Could you help explain what it was? And they can get that support from the network of founders.
Wow. So you built an incredible system. It's updated every cohort, and wow.
Great.
I'm impressed. Wow. And how do you find mentors, or are your ex-alumni mentors as well?
Yeah, so that's why we have a very strong community. And so the previous cohort founders are helping the current cohort founders. And we believe that that's the only way this mentoring can work. Because when you have external founders, it's great because they may have a much wider experience. But if they're too far ahead of you, then they're not able to help you take that next small step that you need to. Yes. So we find that each step you need help from someone, and that might be a very small step for you, right? Or it may feel like a very small step, but for you it feels like a very large step, right? So you need somebody who's in the next step to help you get up to that step, right? So that's the community that we've built, and that's how we enable our current founders to get help from the previous cohort founders. Because also the language and the modules that they have done, they will be able to say, look, when you're doing this, this is what we did, and this is how it worked out for us, or it didn't work out for us, and this is what you should do. so that it's much more relatable versus when
Yeah.
we have external mentors. We generally use external mentors for things which are very strategic. So for making connections, for introductions, for reaching out into broader communities. Those are the places where we have a lot of external mentors who are able to help.
But I guess your community is online, right? You have a channel or something like that.
Yeah, we use Slack and WhatsApp typically.
Mm-hmm.
We also do social meetups. So we had one in Chennai. We do it in different cities. We had one in the US in SF as well.
Ah,
So we
okay,
keep
nice.
doing that in different places just so that founders can get together and meet each other.
But to join a cohort, you don't have to be in India or something like that, right?
That's right. So in the 6 months, we expect to meet 3 to 4 times.
Mm-hmm.
Again, when we meet, there is no content. We are just getting founders and getting people to meet. So on Saturday, we did a meetup in Chennai. So we had a founder, we had 3 different founders who had just exited their SaaS businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were there. It was a closed door session. They were sharing all the lessons, which they won't share on stage. These folks were building relationships. In the past, when we've done the same thing, 2 of the exits that happened in Uppekha were from the buyer startup was actually somebody we had introduced in one of these social meetings.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely love what you're building. I'm impressed. And how can investors join? How can they?
Yeah. So we have the fund, right? So investors can invest in our fund, and when they invest in our fund, if any of our startups are raising subsequent rounds or in that same round, sometimes if they have space, then we open it up to investors who work with us. So that is the Upekha fund, the up fund, and that's currently online, and people can subscribe to it.
Super. And I saw that you offer $700,000 worth of credits in some SaaS companies, and I think that's incredible. So let's talk about that. They have the whole ecosystem there, right? For startups.
So AWS, Amazon, Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud have all been super helpful to many of our startups. And that's about $100,000 of the credits. We also have a lot of SaaS specific tools which SaaS founders will use to build their business. So those are also there, and they're offering credits. Freshworks for startups offers credits, about I think $17,000 of credits. So right. So we have HubSpot is a very commonly used among our startups, and they offer a substantial amount of credits for our startups. So for most SaaS founders, they will not need to spend money on tools with this stack.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And can people that aren't in the weren't in any of the other cohorts join the community on Slack or things like that? Or
no,
is it,
so
private?
Right now it's a closed private community.
Okay.
Because we want to keep it high trust, and we have a no asshole policy. So the only folks who get in are filtered for that. So
yeah, that's understandable.
It's open.
I was asking because I was curious to know if I can join as well, but that's understandable. Yeah,
we can do an AMA with you. Yeah.
Okay. When is the next cohort? In January, right?
So the next cohort actually starts this month, but the applications for that are closed. And the cohort after that will be in, I think, February.
And how do you plan to?
Close in January.
Yeah. How do you plan to, or how did you find your first startups to join the program?
Sure. So before I started Upekha, I was running product and growth for the Microsoft Accelerator in Bangalore. So I already had a large network of founders that I was working with. So out of the first cohort, 2 startups were startups that I had worked with before in the Microsoft Accelerator, and they joined us because they wanted to continue working with us to grow their businesses. And 2 startups basically found us inbound through the same network that I had built in the Microsoft Accelerator. So even today, 50% of our startups that come in are through referrals.
That's the power of network.
Yeah. If you build a good accelerator, then getting more founders is not.
And when did you start Uppekha?
Started in I think May 2017.
Mm-hmm. And do you have other co-founders?
Yes, I have 2 co-founders. One of them is Shekhar Nair. So he was an entrepreneur in the US. He was part of the founding team of a company that went IPO. Then he ran another startup, and then he sold that part of the startup to Juniper. Then he was heading NetApp in India and running sales for them all across Asia. So he's one of our co-founders. The second co-founder is Tyagarajan. So he's been an entrepreneur himself. He started a India chapter of Mobile Monday, which was a very popular mobile app developer ecosystem. Rajan also started multiple other communities of entrepreneurs. He was also a product manager at Intuit after his startup. So he's had multiple startup experiences as well. But all three of us have worked with entrepreneurs for many, many years.
Lovely story. And how big is your team right now?
We're about 35 people right now.
Wow. But why do you need so many people? How do they help?
Right. So we have a fund, right? So there are some people working in the fund. Then we have a ops team which works with each cohort of startups. So since we're running like 3 cohorts of startups a year, so we have an ops team that runs for each. Then of course there's an admissions process. So there's an admissions team which is working with each of these startups.
I understand. Yeah.
And we also do quite a bit of support for these for startups. So we have all the perks that we have, and we also have a job board for all our startups put together. There are about 120 jobs on that right now. So all of this stuff requires a fair bit of back-end work.
Yeah. And can you share with us more of your backstory even before Microsoft? How did you start your career?
Sure. So I did my master's in the US, came back to India, joined a startup, joined another startup for about 5.5 years. Then I did one more startup, and the second startup that I did would have been, if I had known about SaaS, I would have called it SaaS at that time. This was in 2010-11.
Wow.
So that's been kind of the journey. And then I joined Amazon as a product manager in the advertising team. I did that for about a year, and then joined the Microsoft Accelerator, working with startups on product and growth.
So you're a serial entrepreneur as well?
Yes.
Good. What I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the biggest mistake that founders make nowadays? Or top 3, however you think.
Yeah. So I think many founders, I'll restrict myself to B2B SaaS, right?
Yeah.
I think many founders who run B2B businesses, the number one mistake that they make is solving a problem that doesn't really matter to the customer. So maybe most of the folks who come into B2B have previous experience, but they pick a problem that doesn't really matter as much to the customer, and that might be from the background that they have, or they might have come to some process to pick that. Usually, it's like a small shift in what problem you're solving could be a very big difference in the value to the customer.
Yeah.
And an example I can share is that one of the founders was building a software which is in all of accounting, right? So they were building an accounting AI. And so I was telling these founders, look, you can't solve everything in accounting as a startup and expect your customer to buy that from you, right? And so they narrowed it down, and then now they're solving a problem where it seems very trivial. It's very, if you tell somebody what that is, they'll be like, okay, is that really a problem that you have solved? But in the last 12 months, they've gone from $0 to $800,000 in revenue. And when they first saw it, they thought it's a very trivial problem, but now they realize that it's a very big problem. And more than that, it has immediate value, very high value to the customer. And the customer is able to see that value very quickly. And that's why when we talk about the flywheel, you have to be able to sell it at a low cost. If you want to be able to sell something at low cost, that means that the customer has to see value very fast.
Yes.
If it takes 12 months for the customer to see value, then, it's not going to sell very quickly, right? So that's the number one mistake that we see founders make, which is pick a problem to solve. It might be a real problem for the customers, but it's not an important enough problem. It's not an urgent problem. It's not a problem that's there all the time. And it's not a problem that has very high value. I think this is what the number one mistake that founders make.
But I think
if I have to just
Yeah.
give you one more.
Sure.
This is not a B2B problem, but co-founder relationships are very, very critical. And most startups actually fail in the early stages because of bad co-founder relationships. And people think that, co-founder conflict has to be managed. But when people think about co-founder conflict, they only think about it as we are fighting, right? But actually, a lot of the co-founder conflict that we see, which causes startups to fail, is because, hey, if you and me were co-founders, you are thinking slightly differently, I'm thinking slightly differently, so therefore when a feature gets built, or when I'm trying to sell something, you're selling it this way, I'm selling it this way, everybody in the team is little confused, the customer is confused, everybody's confused. So it's not like really fighting, but not really, aligned, right? And that causes way too much slowing down of startups.
Understand, yeah. It's a great perspective of how you shared it. I really understood. And on the other side, what's one piece of advice that you'd have for them?
Sure. So I think that the number one thing that founders should do is talk to lots of customers. And when you talk to customers, you have to talk to them in a way where you're not selling. And that's very hard for founders. So you have to be able to, discover what that customer's problems are. I think there's a nice book called The Mom's Test. I would recommend that all early stage founders read that and figure out how to have conversations where you're only speaking for 30 minutes, 30% or 20%.
Yeah.
Because otherwise founders just speak for 80% of the time and they're selling all the time and they're like, hey, buy this from me, right? You need this, right? And all the leading questions, right? Versus founders should learn how to speak for only 15-20% of the conversation, make sure that the other person is actually talking to you a lot and also helping you understand what their life is like.
Yes.
And if you do, 50, 30, 100, 200, 300 of those conversations, then you will really be able to build a great business.
That's a great piece of advice. I love it. I love it. And I have one last question. What's your favorite software?
Right now, I think my favorite software is probably Zoom, because I can meet so many people, talk to so many people around the world, and it just works for the large part. Right.
That's awesome. Is there anything else that you have to tell us today?
Sure. So I think B2B SaaS is a great place to be, and if you want to build a great B2B SaaS business and grow it fast, then look at Uppekha.io and apply to our next cohort.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for helping the community.
Sure. Thanks, Christian. Thanks for having me on.